Hi, this is Pookie Knightsmith, and I'm going to share with you a presentation that I did recently to specialist eating disorders CAMHS practitioners in Scotland, where we looked at how they can best utilise their time when working with schools. So the first thing to remember is that actually we are very kind of limited in terms of times and resources. So what I'm going to be looking at today is a brief selection of different things that you can do. And we do have to remember that actually you can't do everything. So we're going to look at three different priorities, which we'll discuss in turn. So looking at policies and procedures, looking at how we can upskill our staff and young people in schools, and then thinking about how we can support the most vulnerable individuals that we're working with. So first of all, we're going to consider policies and procedures. Now, this is something which I really struggle with. As someone who has been a chair of governors and actively involved with schools, when you look at policies, there's something not quite right here. So every school writes their own policies, and they are, when looking at something like eating disorders, coming from a starting point of perhaps not a huge amount of knowledge or experience. So each school is writing an individual policy. In my opinion, that just doesn't really make sense. And so what we can think about is whether it makes sense for us to write model policies and procedures that can then be adapted by those schools and colleges in our local area. So if we use our specialist CAMHS knowledge to write those policies and those procedures, then we perhaps can provide better guidance. I do have a model policy which you will be able to find if you go to www.inourhands.com and have a look at the free resources. You can download a model policy there, and you could use that as a starting point if you wanted to, but you might choose to write your own. So in order to kind of make this work, there are a few things we need to do. First of all, yes, schools don't have the specialist knowledge and expertise of eating disorders we have, but they do have the specialist knowledge and expertise of how a school works. So we need to make sure that we're working with a school when we're developing the model policy. You might just choose to work with one school locally that you've got on particularly well with, or you might choose to have perhaps a small focus group of people from a range of schools. When we're writing policies for schools, it's really important that we make them practical. That's the only way to ensure they're not just some document that gets filed away somewhere and never used. So actually think about, what will this look like in practice? And everything you write needs to have a purpose. We need to think about what information we can bring in that we're aware of that can help locally. So there'll be some headline stuff that's kind of, accepted best practice or national sources of information and advice, but often there's a real treasure trove of information and support that's available locally that we might know about, that the school might currently not, and we can make that available in the policy. Clear referral paths is an absolute must. Many schools don't have a clear policy for referring mental health issues within the school, both eating disorders and other issues more generally. It's really important that we name people who are the person to whom these issues should be referred. What we find otherwise is sometimes that young people will just fall through the gaps, that everybody thinks someone else is dealing with it. So we've got to be very, very clear on who is responsible for this and what happens next and when. So what will happen occasionally is you've written your policy, perhaps you haven't made it practical enough, or you haven't thought about its implementation, and it gets filed away forevermore. I've seen this happen to plenty of school policies. So what do we do to make sure this doesn't happen to us? Well, we think about how we can upskill our staff and our students. And part of this kind of training and support that we do will be specifically helping them to understand and implement these policies and procedures. So what we need to do first is think about what we need to do in terms of training and support for every member of staff. And when I say all staff, I mean it very, very literally. I've worked with schools in the past where I've trained everyone right up from well, we call them midday supervisors now, but you would know them as dinner ladies, right up to the head teacher and everybody in between. So we'd be looking at ideas that can be implemented by absolutely any member of staff who had a concern about a young person. So what you need to be doing there is helping them to get a basic understanding of eating disorders. Don't assume any knowledge at all. The range of knowledge and experience that you'll find within any given school will vary massively. There will be pockets of excellence, but there will also be people who literally haven't heard of the various different eating disorders before, and what they do know will be what they've learned through headlines and media. The next thing you can do are to highlight early warning signs. I try and keep these to a minimum. and make them very relevant to the school setting. But the thing is that school staff are in a great position to pick up these early warning signs. And we all know that the earlier that we're able to discover that someone might be suffering with an eating disorder, the better able we are able to help, and the more impactful their recovery is likely to be. We can help all staff know how to support in the first instance. So this is responding to a disclosure. If a young person decides to open up to a member of staff about their eating difficulties, or having that first conversation if they've got a feeling that perhaps something's wrong, and they want to just offer their support to a young person in the first instance. Many staff feel very uncomfortable doing this, and there's often an assumption that this role should rely purely on certain members of staff at school, but actually we all need to be prepared to handle those disclosures. What we find is that we'll put in place policies and procedures that say, if you've got concerns about yourself or a friend, you need to talk to your form tutor or your head of year or the head of pastoral care, whatever it might be. But what we find is that young people go and seek out the member of staff with whom they feel most comfortable, and that could be just anyone. And finally, we need to make sure that all staff are aware of the policies and procedures that we've written. We need to let them know what the content is there, ensure that they understand it, and make sure they know how to follow those referral pathways, and who is responsible, who they need to be talking to with concerns. Next, we need to think a bit about what we do in terms of training our more specialised staff. Now, pastoral staff who are responsible for the well-being of young people, covers quite a wide range of people within school. So this might be heads of year, it might be form tutors, PSHE teachers might be interested in this too. And also it's very important that we include people like behaviour support assistants and learning mentors within this kind of training as well. Often they've got a slightly different relationship with young people and do end up taking on quite a pastoral role. So we need to help them understand first about when and how to refer, and that's both within the school procedures, so when should they be escalating their concerns to another member of staff, but also we can be talking to our higher level pastoral staff about how to make a CAMHS referral. There is unfortunately quite a lot of bad practice within schools, which you're probably well aware of, and so your schools locally need to understand what are the thresholds for a referral, when is it worth them making that referral, and how do they go about doing it in the most helpful way. I often talk to schools about how making a CAMHS referral is a bit like doing an exam, and actually you've got to provide as much and as clear evidence as you possibly can, and that you can't get frustrated if your referral doesn't make it through if you haven't provided the relevant evidence, and that's important learning for staff. We need to help staff at school understand how best they can work with CAMHS. Often schools think that CAMHS isn't very available to them, and often the restrictions on our time and budgets can mean that that is perhaps the case. But we can tell them who is the best person to talk to, when it's appropriate to make that call. For example, I would always be encouraging schools to speak to someone at CAMHS prior to making a referral if they're not quite sure if someone's kind of on the borderline or not. Often CAMHS can give really good advice, and a 10-minute phone conversation can save the time of making a referral if it's not quite the right time yet. Or it can make us think, yes, this has become urgent and I really must do it right away and raise awareness of a case. We can also talk to staff about how they can support students one-to-one, and that might be a student who's receiving treatment, that might be a student who's waiting to receive treatment, they might be on the waiting list, or it might be a student who falls below threshold and actually their care falls to the school and perhaps some other local agencies. There's much that can be done, and this is where the likes of behaviour support assistants, learning mentors, those one-to-one staff really come into play, although often a form tutor or other member of staff might take on this kind of role too. And then finally, we can talk to pastoral staff about what's realistic in terms of their expectations for young people. So we might be thinking there about academic expectations. Should we be revising what we expect of young people in terms of academic expectations? We might be thinking about what's realistic in terms of recovery. It can be really hard for school staff to accept that this is something that might take quite a time. And we might talk about setting realistic goals and smart targets, essentially, things that can be sort of achieved and measured. And finally, we might look at working with young people themselves. So doing some awareness raising work can be very, very beneficial to students and can help them to help their friends. Often disclosures come not from a student themselves, but from a friend who's concerned. So we can help to support that. So the kinds of things we'd be looking to cover. So first of all, just general information. Again, educating young people. What are eating disorders? What are the major types? We'd also want to do some work around myth busting. So there's often all sorts of misconceptions about eating disorders. Things like it's attention seeking, or you can tell by looking at someone if they've got an eating disorder, or that you have to be very, very, very thin to be diagnosed with anorexia. Lots of young people won't come forward with their concerns because they don't think they're ill enough. And so it's important that we do help them to understand that they may be entitled to and in need of support, even if they're not yet at a critical weight. We can help young people understand how and where and why they should be seeking help. We can help them understand who they can talk to and what's likely to be the outcome of that conversation. We'd be helping them to understand both where they can seek help within school and also where they can seek help more generally as well. And often a really helpful thing to tell young people here is to make them aware of the various helplines that they can speak to anonymously. That can often bridge the gap. When a young person is almost ready to start talking about their problems and they've acknowledged there's an issue here, but the idea of a face-to-face conversation is too daunting, or they're worried about their parents being told, then encouraging them to talk to a helpline like Childline or the Samaritans can help them practice. It can help them feel what it's like to talk about those issues out loud, to practice what they're going to say, and to practice saying that without being, without feeling that they're being judged, and without fear that those concerns will be passed on. We can also do more general work with students about healthy coping. So if we look at eating disorders as a form of unhealthy coping for many of the young people who suffer with them, then we can do preventative work around teaching students healthier ways to cope. And we can start that from a very, very young age, looking at big emotions. How do we deal with them in a healthy way? And then finally, we can help students to understand what it is to be a good friend and how they can offer support to their friends. So that might be doing things like the warning signs you'd look out for that might tell you that a friend is in need of your support. It might also include some discussion around the fact that sometimes if you're really worried about a friend, that you might need to go and tell a teacher, even if your friend's not completely on board with that idea. And having that conversation in an open environment where young people can ask questions about it can be really helpful and can kind of give young people in the room permission to go and have that conversation. So in terms of some outcomes from there, you might think about looking at actually developing centralised workshops for young people. You might provide guidance to schools in order to develop workshops of their own for their students, but it might be that you decide centrally that you'd like to deliver them. It's just going to depend really on what kind of resources available to you. It can work very well having an expert come in and talk to students. They can listen a bit more carefully, and sometimes they feel that they can talk more openly and ask more questions when it's someone who they're not used to being taught by every day. I often get a very good response when I go in and work with students on topics like self-harm or eating disorders. However, on the other hand, it can be really helpful to upskill members of staff in order to be able to do this teaching themselves, because they've got a much better knowledge of the students in their class. So there's some ups and downs, but this is something you might think about doing, is developing local workshops and delivering those. So in order to make that work, you would want to work together with the school. So you want to make sure that you're writing a programme that's relevant to their students. You might think about actually doing a survey of the students in order to understand exactly where their needs lie. You need to be realistic about timings, and this is something that as an outsider going into a school we often get really badly wrong. So a school will say to you, right, well, you've got an hour to work with year 9, and you'll think great, and you'll plan a session that's going to last an hour, but actually you've only really got 50 minutes. They're going to arrive 5 minutes late because they've come from another class, and they're not going to pay attention right till the end often, because you'll often get given, the end of the day slot. Essentially, you'll often get that time shaved down. And it's also something that you'll often find when you're beginning these conversations with young people and they've not had the chance before, that they'll have a lot of questions, and it's important that they have time to explore those questions, and so trying to fit too much information in can be unrealistic. The other thing is that we'll often think, well, what we really need is 4 hours of curriculum time in order to make this work, and actually you'll often find that your local schools just can't possibly fit that in their curriculum, so you're trying to have the most impact in the least amount of time. If you can, it's great if you can bring in the voice of young people, and you might do this by using something like a Beat ambassador or a young person that you know who's recovered to co-deliver the session with you, as long as you're confident doing that safely. Or you can access things like videos of young people talking about their experiences online. The charity Fixers, if you just Google Fixers, you'll find them quite easily. They enable young people to make videos about their own experiences. And one of the things that they often tackle is mental health. And there's quite a range of videos about eating disorders that young people have made that could help you here. And then finally, you might think about how you can increase the reach of the workshops that you do in class. And so you might think about perhaps sharing them on the internet as well. So even just sharing the slides so young people can revisit them, or sharing other sources of extended information on their online learning environment can be really helpful. The thing to bear in mind is there will be young people in the room who are affected, but they might not want to be seen to be writing everything down because they might not want to draw attention to themselves. So providing easy access to the materials afterwards can be really helpful. The key thing, though, when we're talking with young people at school and with schools in general, is that we want to enable them to start this conversation. Often this is a topic that will have been very taboo. The kids might have talked about it amongst themselves, but it's often not very openly talked about at school. So we want to enable them to open up and talk about it. So this is one school. So we wanted to create an environment where eating disorders weren't taboo, where students could confidently raise concerns about themselves or a friend, and where staff knew how to respond appropriately if they did. And I think that's a really, really good set of aims, and it does take hard work, but it absolutely is achievable. Okay, finally, we're thinking about how we might support those most vulnerable individuals. So those individuals who are perhaps already receiving care. So this might be someone who is an inpatient that we're looking to support. It might be someone who is just below the threshold, but who requires additional support. Perhaps we can have a little bit of input there. It might be someone who's accessing outpatient treatment, or someone who's considering a return to school following inpatient treatment. So different kinds of people that we might be looking to support on an individual basis. So first of all, those young people who are actually below the threshold. Now, the iceberg here is just because actually there are so many more young people who are sitting below that threshold for CAMHS support for an eating disorders diagnosis than there are who kind of poke above the surface there. And so we need to think really carefully what we can do to help them. The other thing is that there's often much that can be done in these very early stages when an eating disorder is subclinical, and we can do much to help to try and prevent that young person getting a fully blown diagnosis. And you'll all be very well aware that what will often happen is that a young person is sitting below the threshold, they're not referable, they're not diagnosable, and what happens is that we watch and we wait until finally they do reach that threshold, and then they fall into our care. And so this is just really thinking about what can we do to kind of prevent and manage that a little bit. And there are things we can do. So we can recommend good books, good websites, forums, places that school staff can go and parents can go to seek advice and help and support about how they can help a young person in these early stages. And if we make personal recommendations of books that might help, for example, that can be incredibly helpful. The key thing here is about increasing the confidence of school staff. They don't think that they can manage these cases, and so sometimes they don't try. They think it's beyond their capabilities, but it's not. Often they've got very, very good skills and experience in terms of supporting young people more generally, and they're able to use those with these young people who are falling below the threshold. You can also make them aware of local services. So sometimes where they're not yet eligible for CAMHS, we'll find that actually they are eligible to access local services. There's lots of voluntary support available often that can be accessed. And then finally, we can look back to what we were talking before about the training of school staff, and we can think about how we can develop those one-to-one skills. So someone who's perhaps sitting below the threshold for CAMHS at the moment isn't diagnosable. They might be able to have some regular time with, say, a behaviour support assistant or another member of pastoral staff, and they might be able to receive their support that way. That does mean that that member of staff needs to feel really confident doing that one-to-one work. I'm not suggesting you turn them into a fully blown therapist or counsellor, though some schools do have those staff on hand as well, but rather that you turn them into someone who can confidently support and who knows very well at what point this concern needs to be escalated and passed on. When working with outpatients, it's really important that CAMHS actually speak to the school and help the school know what can they do between sessions. I've heard lots of cases where the school's trying to help, but they feel really, really unable to do so in an appropriate way. And sometimes we can end up actually doing damage because we are giving conflicting messages to a young person at school because we're not aware of what's happening in those sessions. So actually giving instructions to the school is really, really helpful. They don't mind being told what to do. They really want your guidance. It can be helpful as well to talk to the school about what it's helpful for them to share. Should they be making, staff more widely aware of some of the young person's difficulties? For example, should we be saying this is a young person who needs extension time on their homework or to receive a bit less work at the moment? Or it might be someone who needs to be kept an eye on to make sure they're not exercising too much in the gym at lunchtime. So we need to just be aware essentially of what are particular issues here and how can we support. And then we need to think carefully about how can we keep in touch with the school. This is something that often falls down. So the school are desperate to hear from you, and often you want to talk to the school, but actually both parties are really quite hard to get hold of. So thinking about how best can we talk to each other. Is it best to have face-to-face meetings, talk via email, talk via phone? What's the best time? It's all really, really simple stuff, but actually working out what works well with a particular school can be a really, really helpful thing to do. Thinking next about inpatients, so those young people who've actually come into your service for care. And this is very simple really. When a pupil goes into inpatient care, they often just disappear. We want to know how to help, what to tell friends, whether to send messages or work. We feel lost and just need some guidance. So really this is just schools saying, just tell us what's going on, tell us how we can help. They don't know what to do and they just need a little bit of help and guidance from you again. Again, you'll see there's quite an underlying theme here really of just communication. You've got so much skills, experience, expertise that you can share with schools and they're really just crying out for it. They just really want you to talk to them where you have the time and the ability to do so. And then you've got those young people who have been an inpatient and now they're looking at the return to school. So some things that you might consider with the school are making sure that all those policies and procedures are 100% up to date, that every member of school staff understands the early warning signs of an eating disorder, they know who they're talking to, they know what the procedure is. We've got to make sure those policies are right up to date and that everybody knows how to use them. We'll have some staff training. Part of that will be about reminding people about those policies and procedures, and part of it will be about the other skills that we've talked about earlier. Essentially, we want to make sure that we've got a confident staff body who know how to support this young person when they return to school. We might think with the school about whether this young person should return to school all at once or if that return should be phased. Now this is something which varies for individual to individual and often it will depend on what some of the underlying concerns are. For some young people, school is one of the things that might have been a key contributing factor to their eating disorder. And so returning might be very difficult and they might want to do so slowly in order to be able to manage the feelings of anxiety that surround that. For other young people, they just want to be back to normal as quickly as possible. This can often happen particularly if they're starting at the beginning of a new school year. If we do decide to do that, we just need to make really, really sure that there's very, very good support in place. That's true in any instance. The return to school is something that can very often trigger relapse, so we just need to be very, very careful to do it carefully. Oh, I'm going backwards, sorry. Okay, next we would want to talk to a school about how they can best support meal times. This is something that freaks schools out. If you've had a young person as an inpatient, you know very well how to support them through a meal. You might have even trained parents to do it by this point, but the school will be untrained in doing so. They need to know what they should be doing, what they should be looking out for, how to do it best. You might also think with them about, well, should this young person have, a parent perhaps attend school at lunchtimes if the parent's got very good at supporting those meal times. You might just want to encourage some flexibility. Also thinking about what the young person should eat. It might be a bit too much to expect a young person to go straight to eating from the cafeteria menu, and so you might want to talk to schools about sort of meal plans or acceptable foods and that sort of thing. And finally, the school will often look to you for guidance with regards to sport and PE. They'll want to know, should this young person be accessing sport and PE or should they not? You'll be able to provide good guidance on that and when it's appropriate for them to access sport. Really, we want young people to be able to access as much of the curriculum in as normal a way as possible as they are recovering, because this can sort of help to prevent sort of stigmatization and questions from their peers. But at the same time, we need to do what is safe and manageable for that young person. And with all these questions, it's really important that we involve the young person themselves in these discussions. They need to feel very much in control of this recovery process and this return to school. Where they don't feel in control, that can often exacerbate the underlying issues. Okay, finally, just going to look at some resources that you might recommend to schools. So often what can be really helpful, more helpful than anything else, is being able to say to schools, here are some things that you might want to try, that you might want to use. Oh yeah, sorry, bit of a self-promotion here, but I do hope that you would find this to be a good guide. So my new book, it's just come out April 2015, provides very, very practical support and advice for schools on a range of issues relating to self-harm and eating disorders, everything from how to teach about them safely through to how to spot the warning signs and how to support students who are suffering with these issues. So I hope that's something that you'd feel confident recommending. The next thing you might want to do is to point them towards the free resources available from Dove, which are really fantastic. So the website's on the screen now. You can download workshops here, and they're about increasing self-esteem and promoting body image. And this is something that schools might want to do as part of their curriculum. You can also ask Dove to come and deliver the workshops to your students, and they will do that for free for 11 to 14-year-old students in the UK. And then you might also like some recent guidance about teaching about body image, which I wrote for the Government Equalities Office in my role at the PSHE Association. I'm their mental health and emotional wellbeing advisor. You can download that from my site on the link above here. And this is quite extensive guidance. It talks about how to teach about body image and related issues safely. It does acknowledge that body image is not the key underpinning factor for eating disorders, and also that poor body image can contribute to a range of things. But this can often be a good starting point. If schools want to do something preventative in terms of eating disorders, then teaching about body image is something they will often find to be kind of palatable and accessible, and it's acceptable to parents and governors and staff. The guide also includes a range of resources which are recommended for teaching about body image, including some entirely planned lessons and curriculums that schools could adopt. Another place you might look to refer people to is the BEAT website. The website generally is a great treasure trove of information. I'm a trustee of BEAT, so I am perhaps a little biased, but you know, we've worked really hard to make sure there's really, really good information available there. So the website itself, just generally very good for young people, good for parents, good for school staff, but they do also specifically offer training for schools. So it might be that a school looks to commission someone from BEAT to come and deliver this training, and they can do that by going to the URL displayed here. Okay, I think we're there. I think if you manage to make it right to the end, then you deserve some sort of medal. I hope it's been helpful, and just a reminder really as we get to the end here that I've shared loads and loads of ideas here, and you shouldn't expect to be able to do all of them at once. So, you know, as we say here, you can do anything but not everything. So just pick and choose your battles, have a think. You know, you've probably scribbled down some notes as you've been writing this, and just have a think about what's actually achievable for you and the schools that you're working with, and what will have the most impact. Try and have the most impact with your time. A few further sources of support here. So BEAT is the Eating Disorders charity, which I referred to a couple of slides ago. CWMT is the Charlie Waller Memorial Trust. Now this is a trust that I am an associate trainer for. They provide free training to schools, colleges and other organisations working with young people on a range of topics related to mental health, including eating disorders. So they might be worth a look. Their website also has a lot of information about depression. Students Against Depression is a good accessible website aimed specifically at university age students, but very relevant for people who are a little younger as well. Mind and Childline you'll doubtlessly have heard of. And then finally, my website, so inourhands.com, has got quite a lot of free resources that you can download or you can recommend to schools, which are on topics related to self-harm, eating disorders and other mental health issues. There's quite a lot of information there, including some model policies that you might choose to adopt. You're welcome to email me or tweet me at PookieH if you want any further help or advice. I hope this has proved helpful. If it has, then do please let me know, because I'm very happy to do more of this kind of thing. But if nobody's finding it helpful, then I won't. Okay, thanks ever so much for listening. Goodbye.